Welcome, friends, to City Impact. And we're talking about how the body of Christ is coming together across cities right throughout our nation and what God is doing in the area of collective impact. Collective impact is where churches really lay down their own particular focus and embrace a collective focus where the body of Christ is working together towards health and harvest. And I have a great friend of mine from Vancouver, Tim Dickau. He's our guest today. He's got an amazing story, an amazing ministry and journey, and I know you're going to enjoy it as we get into this conversation. So, Tim, welcome to the conversation here this morning. What's the weather like in Vancouver?
Well, it's not too bad. You know, we try not to tell people when it's too good here anyway, so because for fear that we'll be bragging out here, so we have to be careful.
Yeah, I know you've got some pretty nice weather out here. We're in the rain here in Halifax, Nova Scotia at the moment, but anyways, we're looking forward to this conversation today and to talk about collective impact. Tim, you've been a pastor for 30 years and you're now involved as director of Citygate Vancouver. What's Citygate Vancouver, and how did you get from pastoring a local church to leading a ministry called Citygate?
Well, I did pastor at Grandview for 30 years and started when I was 26, so it was a good long journey and a good learning journey, and I'm sure we'll talk more about some of the things we developed there. But I reached a point where I'd had enough and kind of reached a point of burnout, and so I needed to take a break, and at that point I was asked to lead Citygate, which is an organization which was started to help foster collaboration amongst churches in order to work together to address common areas of mission and address systemic problems that we face. And so I took on that role and as director, and have had a lot of conversations when I started about 3.5-4 years ago, and since then have been developing a lot of networks of people working together around common issues. So Citygate is that's our primary strategy, is to develop networks of churches working together with each other and with other people in the city.
Tim, that's an exciting mission and an exciting vision. And I had actually the privilege of being out in Vancouver last spring.
We had such a nice time, Dwight, when you were here.
It was a great time. And I had the privilege of actually walking down the street where you live, and you took me to the church where you pastored. And then you walked me across the street and blew my mind when you showed me the project that you had done in a parking lot across the street that's impacting lives in such a meaningful way. Tell us about what's across the street from the local church there.
Yeah. Well, that was the project name is Co-Here, meaning community here, and it started a long time ago. Our church started to branch into community housing when it all started back in the late 90s when we were looking at buying a nursing home that we were having services in monthly, and that came for sale, and we had a community of people forming that were going to live there. And then when the foundation that we were connected to that was looking at buying it, when we went to make an offer, the city said it was going to require seismic upgrading. So we'd like to joke that they didn't mind if it fell down on older adults, but they didn't want it to fall down on younger people. But if you're in urban planning, you know it's not that simple. But that started us on a journey of forming community houses in proximity to one another, starting with a few houses the church owned by the church, and then eventually many houses. We had at one point 16 different houses, and that vision of sharing life together across economic, social, ethnic boundaries became the vision of Co-Here. And we bought a house next to our parking lot back in the early 2000s with the aim of moving a drop-in center there. We got a bad inspection on the lot, eventually had to tear the house down, had a community garden, and it started a visioning process for us as a church. And we started to focus on housing early on, and then we had a vision, a plan, and it took us a while to get it done, but in 2017 we opened this building. So it's 26 units of housing over top of underground parking, mostly for the church, again, because people in social housing don't require parking, most of them, because they don't have cars. And so the city enabled us to put our parking lot down there and then to build housing over top. 16 of those units are at social assistance rates, and 10 of them are at a sliding scale, all below market value. And it has a lot of community space. The whole ground floor is community space, a community kitchen, a dining room, living room, and office space. And then the studio suites, the 1 bedrooms, 2 bedrooms, all independent units, but they open up into, 5 of them open up into kind of a common living space. And so we designed the building with community in mind, community formation in mind, and it's been a beautiful story to see community form there.
It is an amazing story. In fact, Tim, the interesting thing is that after we had our meeting there in Vancouver last spring, my own children started a journey of needing to find their own accommodations and housing here in Halifax. And in this past year, and through the COVID process, housing has literally doubled in price.
Crazy.
And it really is. And all of a sudden, housing became something that was an achievable thing pre-pandemic to a post-pandemic here in Halifax, unachievable by many. And housing, went from $250,000, $300,000 to get started to $500,000 to get started. And those numbers are earth-shattering to young adults and totally out of reach for so many. And you're providing hope. That was the one thing that I was so impressed with when I got out there, is this is a place where we're caring for people in their needs. And I'm a builder here in Halifax, so I'm particularly passionate about this topic. You are providing homes for people with disabilities, for people on low income scenarios, and also what was the third category you have involved in the building? Refugees, was it not?
Yes, we do have second stage refugee housing. So yeah, so that's another group that's there.
And when you told me that people were able to get, that were on government pensions and so on, to get housing that matched their allowance, which in some cases is $500 and $600 a month, in the most expensive real estate in the world, I was really, really impressed. And I am just so blessed by that vision. And Tim, is that something we can do here in Atlantic Canada, or is it something that could be done in maybe Toronto or Winnipeg or Vancouver? Well, obviously it's happening in Vancouver or Calgary, Edmonton, other Canadian cities. We're hearing about this housing crisis everywhere. I'm hearing from young adults who are very discouraged that they cannot purchase a home. In fact, even rental costs have soared out of reach. What's possible for the church to do in these circumstances?
Yep. Well, we do feel like this is a model that can be spread across the country. I mean, we're probably in the worst shape here. When I started as a pastor in 1989, the average house price in Vancouver was $86,000. Now it's $2.24 million. And so,
isn't that incredible?
Yeah. So again, the rise has been so rapid in housing prices that it's driven most people under 40 away from the city. because they can't afford to live anywhere near it. And so it's a crisis here in Vancouver, so we have to face it here, but it's coming across the country, and your story in Halifax is just a case in point. I've held two gatherings around how churches can participate in affordable housing. I've focused in the last year, particularly around reimagining church properties in the way that we did on our parking lot. And so in April of this year, 2023, brought together 30 people from across the country who are working on this issue, whether it's nonprofit developers, architects, urban planners, theologians, denominational leaders, and said, how can we work together around these issues? And from that, I'm hosting 3 follow-up conferences, or that's the goal. We have one planned here in Vancouver on March 12th and 13th, focusing on theology of land, and then a lot of stories and conversations around how we might utilize and develop our properties. And then hopefully in Toronto and Halifax, planning gatherings too in the next couple of years. And so that's the goal that we're aiming for, because we think, as you say, this is an issue that housing crisis is coming across the country, and churches have a lot of underutilized land that we can consider developing.
I had a chance to be in Ontario last year and met with various different city leaders and gatherings, and to hear the stories of how families are having to actually come together and have multiple families in one dwelling unit that's very overcrowded, but there's just no other way to make living work. What an incredible way for the church to demonstrate the love of God to the communities that are in our neighborhood, in our cities, in our provinces, than to do an initiative like you're talking about.
Yeah, and there's so many ways that churches can begin to respond. I mean, starting with the fact that we have a network of people as a church that, we know each other and we know what people need, and we can just look out for each other and advocate for each other. That's a beginning point that churches have. The other thing I
almost
often
sounds
say,
like Acts, doesn't it?
It does sound like the book of Acts. And then the other thing I often talk about is just how we have a lot of empty bedrooms in houses where people are isolated and lonely. And it's time to fill those empty bedrooms in urban contexts especially. And so we have a lot of older adults living in large houses where they would really benefit from having younger adults around them. And so that's another way we can, just without a lot of building or construction, we can start to think of how we can accommodate one another.
So this, like Tim, this is like a movement you're talking about. It's getting a vision and seeing what opportunities there are, whether they're sharing space in your house or building a multi-unit complex like the one you've got.
Yeah, there's a whole spectrum of responses, and the church at this time of crisis has an opportunity to step forward in ways that other institutions or people don't as individuals, because we have a strength in working together. We have assets in our property. And so how do we begin to utilize these to address this crisis? I feel like if the church can step into that space across the country, it would very much change the perception of the church in the minds of people beyond it.
Oh, I totally agree. And, and sometimes, you just shared about a vision you developed with your local church that I just realized. I didn't realize it when I was out there, that you had the parking in the basement for your local church. So you didn't actually lose parking space by thinking in innovative ways. You were able to retain your parking and meet the needs of people, which is completely innovative.
That's why this model is replicable, because underground parking used to be prohibitive cost-wise to a project, but now given the cost of the land and the overall cost of the project, it's not. And secondly, cities civic governments aren't requiring parking for social housing anymore because they recognize most people don't own vehicles. And so the opportunity of that replicating that model is there where the zoning fits.
Well, Tim, okay, so now you've taken a parking lot and turned it into a miracle there in Vancouver. What about the church that has a building that's surplus? Where would they start? What would they do? Maybe there's someone listening today that has a surplus building somewhere.
Yeah, I think there's two issues that I would name here. One is that we need to utilize our buildings better. So many church buildings sit empty and unused for most of the day. And I was talking with a civic government leader here saying, the church gets tax breaks and we are hoping that they will use their buildings more effectively to serve the public good. And now many churches do. So there's, Cardis has done research around that and shown that many churches are using their buildings well, but some are not. And how can we utilize our buildings better? So for example, in our case, we started social enterprises out of our own church building, starting with a pottery studio that we put in the basement of our church building that became a place for people to learn to do pottery, generate income. We used our kitchen to start a catering business, a social enterprise. And so again, to think creatively, how can we use underutilized space in our church buildings to foster, to carry out the mission of God and care for people? That's one issue. The other is where we have buildings that aren't being used, to look at how can we develop them in ways that serve the church's mission and its own programs, but also serve the neighborhood and the city, whether it's housing or social service space or ways of seeking the good of others in our neighborhoods.
I happen to be a builder developer here in Halifax that loves the local church, passionate about the local church, and passionate about the kingdom of God. And so what you share with me gets me really excited. As a developer, I also know that it's complex to take and develop properties sometime. And there's education and equipping that's needed. We need to have a sense of a vision and some practical steps. It's not insurmountable. You've demonstrated that. Where do we get this education? How do we learn about this whole endeavor of making housing available in ways that you have and you're talking about?
Well, I think there's two areas that I've noticed churches need help. One is in the area of the process of visioning, because if you don't have a clear vision as a church about where you want to go, that will make it hard to make it happen. And so getting some help in a visioning process that involves the church. Don't have to have all the I's and T's dotted, because you can't do that, as you know, with developments until you get a lot of other information, but to get a general vision of what you're aiming for. The second advice that I give all the time is, early on, if you want to explore developing your property, find a good consultant who understands churches and understands development, because you will spend some money doing that. You will save way more money down the road by doing that. And so that's my strong encouragement for churches that are wanting to explore development. The other thing I'd say is that there's a growing expertise across the country, and that's what I discovered when I brought together these 30 folks from across the country. There are more and more people that are pressing into this area and doing creative work and learning a lot. Having said that, every project is an art. It's a bit of an art project to make it all happen. You know that, Dwight, from development. It's not a cookie cutter thing. It takes a lot of creativity to pull a good project together. But get started and get somebody on your side who understands things well.
Now I love the visionary heart that you have. And you have been taking this experience that God placed in your hand, and you have been mobilizing the church across Canada in these kinds of initiatives that we're talking about right now. Am I blowing any surprises by saying you'll be in other parts of Canada talking about this and educating? And my question would be, if I'm not, how can people connect into some of the conferences that you're putting on in providing housing, low-cost housing for people who need it?
Sure. Well, I do want to invite some of you to come out to Vancouver in March for March 12th and 13th for our Reimagining Church Properties gathering here. You know, just to say, March is a pretty nice time to be in Vancouver when the flowers are all out. So it's worth it if you get a chance to come out. So Tuesday night, we're going to be talking about a theology of land. Wednesday morning, we're going to have a number of short stories like Cohere that tell the stories of how churches have used their property creatively. We're going to have politicians and urban planners and urban geographers in the room with us to dialogue, and we'll have some tables for discussion. And then we're going to take people in the afternoon through a process of analysis and decision making that you can use to guide your own church and denomination through. And then we're going to go and see some projects later in the afternoon. So I think it'll be an exciting time in March. We want to do something similar in Toronto and Halifax. We want to focus in Toronto around housing in particular, and to show some projects there. And there are some really creative developers that are doing good work. And then Halifax, we'd like to focus on the relationship of church renewal to land redevelopment and property use, and how these two are linked, and to focus on that. And so that's the plan we want to unroll across the country. We're also partnering with Wycliffe College and developing a relationship with them. They're doing a lot of research around church properties, and we're hoping to involve them in sharing that research at each of these gatherings.
Well, Tim, this has been amazing. Do you have any closing comments of encouragement for those whose hearts have just been set on fire by our conversation, which I know people will be? You basically can't have children that are trying to find homes and drive down the street and see people where it breaks your heart, or living in tents here in Halifax. Hearts are probably on fire right now, mine is. What's your encouragement?
Well, it's hard to drive in Vancouver and drive by a park and not see a tent somewhere these days. Wow. A lot of people, a lot of students living in their cars, for example, out here at University of British Columbia, and so it is a crisis. I think my learning in the last few years has been about the power of churches working together. And so we now have a network of about 20 churches that are working together around caring for refugees and learning from each other, sharing resources with each other, organizations that are working directly with refugees and the church partnering together, and a lot of the same overlapping issues around housing. Many refugees are now being told to go back to the airport and sleep there because there's no transitional housing available for them. And so it's a crisis in a lot of these areas. So churches working together, not only can it help strengthen the work we do, but I think it can strengthen the local church because it gives us a sense of participating in something larger in God's mission in the world. We're also developing a network of churches partnering with schools. Last year, 4 organizations we've brought together that are working together now with churches distributed over $4 million worth of food to families in need. There is so much need for eating and around food security in our city. And so churches that are partnering with schools and coming to them and saying, how can we help? That's a very different orientation from how we've sometimes entered into these kinds of relationships. And doing that opens the doors in ways we haven't seen before. So I think that the church has an opportunity in working together to bring this collective impact and to change the perception of the role of the church again in society, to reinvigorate the sense that the church is important to the well-being of our cities.
You know, what you're sharing is just so encouraging to see what's happening and to see a vision of what might happen as we come together and work together as local churches towards health and harvest. And here in the Aaron Ministry Network, here in Atlantic Canada, we call ourselves Friends in Ministry. And without question, we need to link arms with Friends in Ministry right across the nation and work like you're talking about. Tim, what a blessing. Thank you for joining us today. And we'll look forward to seeing you in Vancouver.
Sounds great, Dwight. You're all welcome out here.
All right.